Now, we know that the 15th Amendment prohibits the discrimination on the basis of race, color, and former slave status. It did not prevent racism from being the reason why certain groups did not have the right to vote. Let's talk about it. The 15th Amendment to the United States of the Constitution, passed in 1870, grants all U.S. citizens the right to vote regardless of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. However, Asians were not guaranteed citizenship or voting rights under the 14th or 15th Amendments. They were not considered citizens of the United States. Let's break it down. In 1875, the Page Act was passed. It was the first restrictive federal immigration law in the United States, and it prohibited the entrance of Chinese women into the United States. Apparently, Chinese women were transmitting sexual diseases that they and Chinese men were immune to, but affected white men. Apparently. No, I'm not kidding. That's what they thought at the time. Seriously. There were other reasons, but they were all racist reasons, like the one I just shared. Following the Page Act was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The act banned Chinese laborers from entering the country for about 10 years and required Chinese people traveling in or out of the country to carry a certificate identifying their status. The act also prohibited Chinese immigrants from becoming citizens and made Chinese residents ineligible to become naturalized citizens, regardless of how long they had legally lived in the country. And state and federal courts could not grant citizenship to Chinese resident aliens. Then there was the Gentlemen's Agreement of 1907. Japan would not allow laborers further immigration to the United States, and the United States would not impose restrictions on Japanese immigrants already present in the country. And did you know that if an American woman married an Asian man, she would lose her American citizenship? I know, fun fact. And of course, there was the Immigration Act of 1924. The law completely excluded immigrants from Asia. In 1943, the Magnuson Act repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act. It allowed Chinese immigration for the first time since the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and permitted some Chinese immigrants already residing in the country to become naturalized citizens. But other Asians still did not have access to citizenship. It was the 1952 Immigration Act that ended Asian exclusion. The act allowed for people of Asian descent to immigrate and to become citizens, which had been banned by laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the Asian Exclusion Act of 1924. That's the Immigration Act of 1924. The 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act removed race as a barrier to immigration and citizenship, allowing for a large increase in Asian immigration. It was not until the Immigration Acts of 1952 and 1965, when Asians were able to obtain citizenship, that they were able to obtain the right to vote, in theory. Now, let's go back a minute, okay? Because when debating the 15th Amendment, congressmen from the West did not want broad verbiage because they did not want to give Asians the right to vote. I'm sure that's why Asians were not considered citizens under the 14th Amendment at the time, but that's a separate conversation. Congressmen from the West disliked Asians like congressmen from the South disliked blacks. They each had their prejudices. Fast forward to the 50s and 60s, the sentiment really hadn't changed. Asian American communities were still restricted from suffrage through literacy tests, property restrictions, and voter intimidation. Does that sound familiar? It does? Okay. Okay. So, my question now is this: when were Asian Americans able to vote without the poll tax, the literacy test, without a comprehension test, without residency requirements, without intimidation? And there are actually two answers. I heard somebody say 1965. Yes, you would be correct. The act that was passed during the Civil Rights Movement, Voting Rights Act of 1965, allowed Asian Americans to vote without a poll tax. Well, actually, that would be the 24th Amendment that got rid of the poll tax. But everything else, the literacy test, the residency requirements, the comprehension test, that was covered under the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was passed to allow Blacks in the South to register to vote and be able to vote without dying. Yeah. Now, there are two answers, right? So, what's the second answer? That one might be a little bit harder. So, I'll give it to you. The second answer is 1975, 3 years after I was born. You see, in 1975, Congress added a section for voters with limited English skills. It's known as Section 203. There are currently 53 jurisdictions in 14 states covered by Section 203 that require coverage in one of 8 Asian ethnic communities. Section 203 protects voting rights of language minorities by providing registration or voting notices, forms, instructions, assistance, or other materials or information relating to the electoral process, including ballots in the language appropriate to the covered minority group. Now, just for funsies, I'm going to call on Texas. Dallas County, Texas, is one of the states that is impacted by Section 203, and Texas is busy trying to gut the Voting Rights Act of 1965. How long before they go to court saying that they shouldn't have to have ballots in Vietnamese, effectively disenfranchising Vietnamese people? And correct me if I'm wrong, we're not just voting for a president in, 11 days? We're voting for representatives and senators, right? People who believe in things like democracy and civil rights, in things like all citizens have the right to suffrage, right? So they shouldn't be getting rid of sections that allow all citizens, including Vietnamese citizens, to be able to vote, right? Right.